Ellie Cross pressed both hands flat against the little girl's chest and pushed. Not a sound in that frozen cabin except the wind battering the walls and the desperate rhythm of her own counting. 1, 2, 3. Grace Holt had stopped breathing 4 minutes ago. The father stood in the doorway, snow still on his shoulders, face gone white as the drifts outside. He didn't pray. He didn't move. He just watched the woman he'd called a fraud fight death with her bare hands and lose the argument with God, one breath at a time. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Ellie and Caleb's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The body came out of the blizzard the same way trouble always did in Silverpass, Montana. Without warning, without apology, and at the worst possible hour. Ellie Cross had been awake since before dawn, same as most mornings. Sleep wasn't something she trusted anymore. It left you too open, too soft, too easy to catch off guard. She'd learned that lesson in a military hospital outside Richmond, Virginia, and she hadn't unlearned it since. So she was sitting at the small table in the back room of Ruth Moreno's boarding house, her lamp turned low, her medical bag open in front of her, re-inventorying what little she had left. Carbolic acid, almost gone. Clean lemon strips, down to the last roll. 3 vials of laudanum she hadn't touched because she knew what happened when women who lived alone started reaching for that particular comfort. Outside, the wind sounded like a living thing trying to claw through the walls. It was December of 1878, and Silverpass had been locked under 2 feet of snow for 11 days straight. The pass that gave the town its name was buried. No supply wagons, no mail, no circuit doctor. Just 400 souls pressed together in the cold, running low on patience and firewood and goodwill toward their neighbors. Ellie had been in Silverpass for 6 weeks, long enough to know she wasn't welcome. Not long enough to figure out where else to go. She heard the pounding on Ruth's front door before she heard the voice. 3 hard knocks, the kind a man makes when he's past politeness. Ruth Moreno appeared in the hallway first, gray braid over one shoulder, a candle in her hand, and no fear on her face. That was the thing about Ruth. 60 years of living in places that didn't want her had burned the fear clean away and left something steadier in its place. "Miss Cross," Ruth's voice was quiet but urgent. "There's a man at the door asking for a doctor." "I'm not a doctor," Ellie said it without looking up. She'd said it enough times in this town that it came out flat, automatic, like saying good morning or "I don't want trouble." "He's got a child." Ellie's hands went still on the laudanum vial. She was at the front door in 12 seconds. The man on the porch was built like he'd been carved from the same material as the mountains behind him. Broad through the shoulders, solid, the kind of frame that made you think of things built to last. He was covered in snow from hat brim to boot heel, which told her he'd been riding hard through the storm and hadn't stopped to shelter even once. His dark hair was plastered wet against his forehead. His eyes were brown and exhausted, and, Ellie noted with a detached part of her brain that never stopped assessing, currently running about 3 degrees north of panic, while his jaw held the south end down through sheer stubbornness. In his arms was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, blonde hair, her father's stubborn jaw, and lips that had gone the wrong shade of blue. Ellie didn't ask his name. She didn't ask permission. She stepped forward and put 2 fingers against the child's throat. Pulse. Weak. There. "How long has she been like this?" "Hour, maybe more." His voice was rough. "Started with shaking. Then she went quiet. She don't usually go quiet." "Fever?" "Yes, ma'am. 2 days now. I've been bringing it down with cold compresses, but tonight it climbed and I couldn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "The doc won't come out in the storm. Sent his boy to tell me to keep her warm and wait." Ellie looked up at him then, just once, just long enough to read his face and find what she expected. A man who had already spent some part of tonight considering the possibility that his daughter was going to die, and had ridden 3 miles through a blizzard because he refused to accept it without a fight. She understood that particular kind of desperation better than she cared to admit. "Bring her inside," she said. "Lay her on the table. Carefully." He followed her without a word. Ruth was already moving, stoking the fire higher, pulling Ellie's bag from the back room without being asked. 30 years of watching people in crisis had made Ruth Moreno the most efficient woman Ellie had ever met. The little girl, Grace, Ellie would learn her name was Grace, lay on Ruth's kitchen table and looked heartbreakingly small. Her breathing was shallow and too fast. Her skin was dry, which was bad. Fever this high and no sweat meant her body was losing the argument. Ellie worked. She didn't narrate. She didn't explain. Her hands moved the way they'd been trained to move, quickly and without hesitation, because hesitation in this kind of moment wasn't caution, it was cruelty. She checked the girl's pupils. She pressed her ear to the small chest and listened. She pried the little mouth open gently and looked at the throat, which was raw and red and angry. "She been eating?" "Not since yesterday." "Drinking?" "Water. Some broth this morning." "Anyone else in your household sick?" A pause, brief, but she caught it. "My boy, Tommy, he's 9. He's got the same thing, but not as bad. Neighbor woman is sitting with him tonight." Ellie looked up. "You left a sick 9-year-old to ride here?" "My neighbor's reliable." "That's not what I asked." The man's jaw tightened. "Tommy told me to go. Said take care of Gracie first." Something shifted in his expression, too fast for Ellie to name it. "He's right most of the time." Ellie turned back to Grace. "I need the fever down, not gradually, now." She looked at Ruth. "Clean snow in a cloth, as much as you can carry." Ruth was out the back door before the sentence finished. "She's going to be cold," the man said. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. "She's already too hot. Cold is what we want right now." Ellie was unwrapping the girl's heavy coat as she spoke, moving fast but gentle. "What's your name?" Another pause, like he'd forgotten the answer. "Holt. Caleb Holt. I run the horse ranch 3 miles west. I know." Ellie didn't look up. "I've been in this town 6 weeks, Mr. Holt. I know who most people are." "Then you know what most people say about you." "I do. And you're still here. Nowhere else to be." She said it the same flat way she said everything. Not hard, not soft, just true. "Hold her hand. She's going to feel the cold, and it might frighten her. I need her to stay calm." Caleb Holt moved to his daughter's side without argument. His big hand wrapped around the little girl's, careful as a man handling something irreplaceable. Which, Ellie supposed, she was. "Gracie." His voice changed when he spoke to the child. The roughness softened into something that cost him something to show. "Daddy's here, sweetheart. You're okay. This lady's going to help you." Grace didn't open her eyes, but her fingers tightened around his. Ruth came back with the snow. Ellie packed it into cloths and began applying it to the girl's neck, her wrists, the insides of her arms. Grace flinched, but didn't cry. Didn't make a sound. "She quiet like this normally?" Ellie asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. "She hasn't spoken," he said finally. "In 3 years." Ellie's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. then kept moving. Not a word? Not since her mother died. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire and the wind. Ellie absorbed that information the way she absorbed most difficult information. Quickly, filed it, and kept working. What was her mother's name? Caleb looked at her sharply, like the question surprised him, like maybe nobody had asked him that in a while. Sarah, he said. Grace looks like her? Something crossed his face, raw and fast. Eyes. She's got Sarah's eyes. Then she's got something worth fighting for. Ellie kept her voice matter-of-fact, clinical. But she watched the little girl's face when she said it, and something shifted in the child's expression. A faint tension around the eyes. A tightening of small fingers around her father's hand. She hears everything, Ellie noted. She understands everything. She's just decided the world doesn't deserve her words anymore. Ellie knew that feeling too. For 40 minutes, she worked. She mixed a preparation from the dried herbs in her bag. Willow bark for the fever, elderflower to bring on a sweat, a small measure of honey and boiled water to make it palatable for a child. She talked to Grace while she worked. Not about the medicine, not about the fever. Just soft, steady talk about nothing in particular. The way the snow sounded different from rain. The way horses could smell a storm coming 2 days before it arrived. Small facts, quietly delivered, like she was filling a room with something gentle enough to push the fear out. Grace's eyes opened somewhere around the 30-minute mark. Blue eyes, pale and exhausted and watchful. They found Ellie's face and stayed there. There you are, Ellie said, without stopping what she was doing. You had us working pretty hard. Grace didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. At the 40-minute mark, the fever broke. It happened the way fevers break when you catch them in time. A sudden dampness at the hairline, a shuddering exhale, a visible easing in the tight set of the small shoulders. Grace's color began to come back, slow and reluctant, like sunrise in January. Caleb Holt made a sound that Ellie didn't look at. Some things a man is entitled to in private. She busied herself cleaning up her instruments. She needs to stay warm and still for the next 24 hours, Ellie said, her back still turned to give him a moment. The fever may try to climb again tonight. If it does, same method. Cold compresses. Get her drinking. Don't let her sleep too long without waking her. Someone needs to check on her every 2 hours through the night. I'll stay. You've got a sick boy at home. My neighbor will. Your neighbor is not a medical person, Mr. Holt, and your son is sick. Ellie turned around. Ruth will sit with Grace tonight. She's done it before. She's steady. She looked at Ruth, who nodded once. Go home to your boy. Come back in the morning. Caleb looked at his daughter. The child looked back at him. Something passed between them that Ellie didn't try to read. I'll go, he said. But I'm coming back at first light. I'll be here. He reached into his coat. What do I owe you? Nothing tonight. His hand stopped. I don't take charity. It's not charity, Ellie met his eyes. I haven't saved her yet. Come back in the morning and we'll see what we're dealing with. Then we'll talk about what you owe me. Caleb Holt studied her face for a long moment, like he was looking for the angle, like he was trying to find the part of this that was going to cost him something he couldn't afford. Ellie held his gaze without flinching, because she had nothing to hide, and she'd learned a long time ago that looking away only made people more suspicious. You're the woman they call the herb witch, he said. Not mean, just flat, saying a thing out loud to see how it sat. Some people call me that. Doc Crane says you've got no credentials, says you're dangerous. Doc Crane didn't come out in the blizzard to help your daughter. Something moved behind his eyes. No, he said. He didn't. He pulled his coat back on. He bent over Grace one more time, pressed a kiss to her forehead so gently it was almost painful to witness, whispered something against her hair that Ellie didn't try to hear. Then he straightened up, put his hat back on, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Miss," he turned, "I don't know your name." "Ellie Cross." He nodded once. "Miss Cross." Another pause. She could see him working through something, rearranging something inside himself, the way a man moves furniture in a room he's kept locked for years. "Thank you." Then he was gone, back into the storm, and Ellie stood in Ruth Moreno's kitchen, listening to the wind and the small, steady breathing of a little girl who had decided, at least for tonight, to keep living. Ruth put a cup of tea on the table in front of her. "He's a hard man," Ruth said. "Most of them are out here. Lost his wife 3 years ago. Fever, same as Grace almost. The doctor didn't come that time either." Ruth sat down across from her, wrapping both hands around her own cup. "He's had a grudge against healers ever since. Against anyone who promises something and can't deliver." Ellie looked at the tea. "He still brought his daughter here." He was desperate. Desperate men make interesting decisions. She picked up the cup. "What do people say about him? The real things, not the polite things." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Fair, hard-working, doesn't ask for help, never talks about what the war did to him." She paused. "Loves those children more than he loves himself, which in this country is either a virtue or a recipe for disaster. Usually both." They sat in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside, and Grace slept on the narrow cot Ruth had moved her to, small and pale and breathing evenly, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like winter wheat. Ellie didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside the cot and checked the girl every 2 hours, exactly as she'd prescribed for Caleb. She changed the cool cloths when the fever tried to creep up again around 3 in the morning. She sat quietly in the dark and listened to the sound of the town locked tight against the cold. All those people who'd looked through her on the street for 6 weeks. All those doors that had closed when she walked past. She thought about what Ruth had said. He lost his wife to a fever the doctor didn't come for. She thought about a man who carried that particular weight, the weight of someone dying while the people who were supposed to help stood back and made excuses. She knew that weight. She'd watched men carry it out of hospitals during the war, the ones who'd survived when their brothers hadn't, the ones who kept asking, why didn't someone do more, without understanding that sometimes the answer was, there was no one willing to try. She'd always been willing to try. That was her problem. That was the thing that had brought her here, to a town that didn't want her, in a territory that didn't know her name. She'd been willing to try when the army hospital ran out of morphine, and she'd gone out and bought more with her own wages. And she'd been willing to try when the man who'd been stealing it from the supply cabinet needed a scapegoat, and chose the woman with the least amount of power to fight back. She was still willing to try. She didn't know how to stop. At first light, Caleb Holt came back. He came through Ruth's front door, with snow on his shoulders, and Tommy beside him. A dark-haired boy, with bright, curious eyes, and a slightly runny nose, who looked at Ellie with the frank, unsettling assessment that only very young children and very old women could get away with. "You're the one who fixed Gracie?" Tommy asked. "Working on it," Ellie said. "Pa said you were a witch." "Tommy." Caleb's voice carried a warning. "I'm just saying what Pa said." Tommy looked completely unrepentant. "Are you a witch?" "If I was a witch, do you think your sister would still have a fever?" Tommy considered this seriously. "No," he decided. "A witch could probably fix a fever easy. You must just be a regular person." Ellie almost smiled. "That's about right." Grace was awake when they came in, sitting up against the pillow with a blanket around her shoulders. She looked better, still pale, still tired, but the dangerous gray-blue was gone from her lips, and her eyes tracked clear and sharp when her brother ran to the cot. "Gracie!" Tommy stopped just short of throwing himself at her, with the admirable restraint of a boy who'd been told not to jostle a sick person. He sat on the edge of the cot instead and grabbed her hand. "You scared me half to death. Don't ever do that again." Grace looked at him. She put her other hand over his, briefly, then let go. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching his children. Ellie watched Caleb. She could see the toll of the night on him, the shadows under his eyes, the slight stiffness in his movement that said he hadn't rested, probably hadn't eaten. He'd come back first thing, not because she told him to, but because he couldn't have stayed away. Some fathers were like that, the good ones. She crossed to where he stood. "Fever was lower at 5 this morning," she said quietly. "I want to keep her here another day. Travel in this cold with a child who's just run that kind of temperature is a bad idea." Caleb looked at his daughter. "And Tommy?" "His throat's inflamed. Same thing Grace had, milder. I can give him the same preparation. He needs rest, fluids, and someone watching him." She paused. "Preferably you. He's at the stage where he'll decide he feels fine and try to do something stupid. And you look like the kind of father who can stop that." Something pulled at the corner of Caleb's mouth. Not quite a smile, just a dent. "He gets it from his mother," he said. "The stupid ideas." "Most children do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, roughly, "What do I owe you? For real this time?" "Firewood," Ellie said. "Ruth's running low, and she won't ask anyone for help." He blinked, like he'd expected a number and gotten a direction he didn't know how to argue with. "I can do that." "Good." She started to turn away. He spoke again. "Miss Cross?" She stopped. He was looking at her with that same careful, searching expression he'd had the night before. That expression of a man inspecting something he's been told is defective and finding himself uncertain. "Why are you in Silverpass?" "Passing through." "In December? Through a mountain pass that's been closed for 11 days? Ellie held his gaze. "Plans change." He didn't push it. She respected that. What she didn't tell him was that she'd known the pass was closing when she'd ridden into Silverpass in late October. She'd known it, and she'd ridden in anyway, because the town before this one had made it clear she needed to keep moving, and the town before that had said the same. And at some point, a person got tired of running toward the horizon and needed to stop and breathe for 5 minutes, even if the place they stopped wasn't exactly safe. She didn't tell him that when she'd asked about work in Silverpass, real work, healing work, the only work she knew how to do, she'd been turned away from the doctor's office, the apothecary, and the 2 homesteads that had come asking for help with sick livestock. All turned away, one after the other, because a woman alone with a medical bag, and no husband, and no papers from any institution these people recognized, was, in the logic of Silverpass, Montana, either a fool, or a fraud, or something darker. She didn't tell him that Senator Augustus Wade had sent a man to Ruth's boarding house just 3 days ago to ask, in very polite language, how long Miss Cross planned to stay in town, or that the very polite language had a very impolite implication underneath it. She didn't tell him any of that. She told him his daughter needed rest, and his son needed the willow bark preparation twice a day, and she handed him a small cloth packet of dried herbs with quiet, precise instructions, and she walked back to the cot, where Grace was watching her from across the room, with those pale blue eyes that saw everything and said nothing. "You'll be all right," Ellie told her, softly, like a promise she intended to keep. Grace looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she reached out and took Ellie's hand. It was the first time in 6 weeks that anyone in Silverpass had reached for Ellie Cross instead of away from her. Ellie stood very still and let it happen, and did not let herself think about what it would cost her when the warmth of it was eventually taken away. Because in her experience, warmth always was. Outside, the snow kept falling. Grace Holt stayed 2 nights at Ruth's boarding house before her father would agree she was strong enough to ride home. Ellie didn't argue the point. She'd seen enough recoveries go wrong in the back half. The child who seemed better got bundled into a wagon too soon and came back 3 days later worse than before. 2 nights was the right call, and the fact that Caleb Holt accepted it without pushing told her he was a man who could hear sense when it was delivered plainly enough. What she hadn't expected was Tommy. The boy had appointed himself Grace's official guardian, spokesperson, and entertainment committee from the moment he'd sat down on the edge of that cot, and he treated the role with a seriousness that would have been comic if it hadn't also been genuinely touching. He negotiated with Ruth over what broth Grace would and wouldn't eat. He reported Grace's temperature to Ellie with the gravity of a field surgeon delivering casualty counts. And he talked. Lord, did he talk. Steady, cheerful, irrepressible commentary on everything from the quality of Silverpass's snowfall, compared to last year's, to the exact hierarchy of horses on his father's ranch, and which one had the best personality. Grace listened to all of it, with her eyes tracking her brother's face and her hands folded in her lap. And occasionally, she would reach over and squeeze Tommy's arm when he said something that pleased her, which Tommy had clearly learned to read as enthusiastic agreement. "She likes the bay mare best," Tommy informed Ellie on the second morning, while Ellie was checking Grace's throat. "Even though Pa thinks she doesn't have a preference. She does. She just doesn't tell him." "I can see that," Ellie said, and glanced at Grace, who was looking at her with those grave blue eyes. "You're good at knowing things without saying them, aren't you?" Grace held her gaze for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone making a deliberate choice, she nodded once. Ellie nodded back. Even exchange. No pressure. "She talked before," Tommy said. His voice didn't change register, but something shifted underneath it. "She is to talk all the time. More than me, even. And Pa says that's saying something." A pause. "Then Mama died, and she just stopped. One day she was talking, and the next day she wasn't. And she hasn't been since." "Tommy!" Caleb's voice came from the doorway. He'd been coming and going, back to the ranch to tend the animals, back to Ruth's to check on his children. The rhythm of a man trying to be in 2 places at once and managing it through sheer stubbornness. "Your sister doesn't need you telling her story to strangers." "Miss Cross isn't a stranger anymore," Tommy said, with perfect 9-year-old logic. "She fixed Gracie. That makes her—" He paused, working through the categories available to him. "Family adjacent." Ellie kept her expression professional with some effort. Caleb looked at his son with the expression of a man who has had this experience before and has not yet found a reliable countermeasure. "Go ask Mrs. Moreno if she needs wood brought in." Tommy went, calling back over his shoulder that he'd return and that someone should save him some of the cornbread if there was any left, because he'd smelled it from the hallway. The room was quieter without him. Grace looked at the door he'd disappeared through, then back at her father, then at Ellie, and settled her hands in her lap with an air of patient waiting. Caleb came further into the room. He stood at the foot of the cot, looking at his daughter the way he always did, like he was taking inventory of everything that was still there. "She looks better." "She is better. Another day of the preparation and she should be past the worst of it." Ellie began repacking her bag. "The cold will still be a concern. Keep her out of the wind for the next week. Don't let her run around in the snow like she's fully recovered, because she'll think she is before she actually is." How do you tell the difference? You watch her. If she tires easily, if the color goes out of her face when she's been up for more than an hour, she needs rest. Ellie pulled the bag strap over her shoulder. You know your daughter, Mr. Holt. You'll know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she hasn't let go of your hand since yesterday. Ellie looked down. Grace had, at some point, reached up and wrapped 2 fingers around Ellie's wrist, loosely, more anchor than grip. She hadn't noticed it happen. I have that effect on quiet people, Ellie said, keeping her voice light. She looked at Grace. I have to go check on Mrs. Garrity down the street. Her hip's been bad since the cold set in. She gently lifted Grace's fingers from her wrist, not pulling away, but setting the small hand back on the blanket with care. I'll come back before supper. Grace watched her, the grave, measuring look that never quite became expression. Then she reached into the pocket of the small coat hanging on the bedpost beside her and held something out. It was a river rock. Smooth, pale gray, the size of a large coin. The kind a child picks up because it fits perfectly in the palm of a hand. Ellie looked at it. For me? She asked. Grace held it steady, waiting. Ellie took it. Thank you, Grace. The child's hands went back to her lap. The transaction was complete. But something around her eyes, some micro-movement too small and too fast to name, suggested that she was satisfied with the outcome. Ellie put the rock in her coat pocket and left before the feeling in her chest could develop into anything she'd have to manage later. The cold outside was immediate and merciless. Ellie walked with her head down and her collar up and her hands in her pockets, and she thought about river rocks and small fingers and the particular quality of silence that Grace Holt carried with her like a second skin. 3 years without a word. 3 years of watching the world from behind those pale eyes and deciding, again and again, that nothing out there was worth the effort of speech. What does a 6-year-old lose that makes her go that quiet? Ellie knew the answer. She'd seen it in the war, in men who came back from battles they couldn't describe. It wasn't that they had nothing to say. It was that they'd discovered that saying things out loud made them real in a way that was unbearable to live with. Grace had watched her mother die of a fever while a doctor stayed warm in his house 3 miles away. Grace had watched her father's grief turn him to stone. And Grace had decided, at 3 years old, that the world in which those things happened was not a world that deserved her participation. Ellie had made a similar decision once. She'd just expressed it by running instead of going silent. She was halfway down the main street of Silverpass, past the general store and the shuttered assay office, when she heard her name. Not her name, her designation. That's her. A woman's voice, low and tight. That's the one Ruth Moreno's been housing. The herb woman. Ellie didn't break stride. She'd learned in 6 weeks that stopping to engage with this particular tone of voice was a mistake. You stopped, you invited confrontation. You kept walking. Sometimes it dissolved on its own. Not today. Miss Cross. The voice sharpened into something with authority behind it. A moment of your time. She stopped, turned. The man who'd spoken was Senator Augustus Wade. She'd seen him once before, across the street, outside the bank, and she'd recognized him immediately. Not because she'd seen his face, but because she'd seen the way people shifted when he moved through a space. The unconscious gravitational adjustment of a room towards someone who holds power. He was tall, well-dressed in the way that announced expense without shouting it, with silver hair and the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into commanding. The woman who'd spoken was beside him, younger, brittle around the edges, with the look of someone performing composure. "Senator," Ellie said. She kept her voice even. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," Wade smiled. It was a smooth, practiced smile, the kind refined through years of needing people to feel comfortable right up until they didn't need to be. "I've heard about you, though. The whole town has. Caleb Holt's little girl. Quite the recovery, I understand." "Children are resilient." "Indeed they are." He stepped closer, not threatening, just close enough to make the conversation private. "I also understand you've been in Silverpass some weeks now, without any clear plan to move on. The pass will reopen in spring. That's another 3 months, at least." "I'm aware." "Dr. Crane is our town physician. He's served this community well for many years." Wade's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "I'd hate for there to be any confusion about roles, or any situation where well-meaning but unqualified assistance created complications." Ellie looked at him steadily. "By complications you mean sick people getting care." "I mean liability." Still pleasant. "Unlicensed practice can lead to all manner of difficulties, Miss Cross. For the practitioner, most of all." He paused. "I'd hate to see a woman in your situation make things harder for herself than they need to be." "My situation?" "Alone, far from home, without credentials or references." His eyes were kind and absolutely cold. "This can be a difficult place for a woman without connections." Ellie held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make clear she wasn't going to look away first. Then she said, "Thank you for the advice, Senator," and walked away. She didn't look back. She heard the woman with him say something sharp and low, and heard Wade's response, smooth, unhurried, the tone of a man explaining something to a child. She didn't try to hear the words. Her hands were very steady at her sides. She'd learned to keep them steady a long time ago. But she was still thinking about that conversation 2 hours later, sitting by old Mrs. Garrity's fire, rubbing liniment into the old woman's swollen hip, and listening to the widow's cheerful, exhausting monologue about the winter of 1861, and how this snow wasn't half as bad as that one had been, not by a long shot. She'd seen worse. And had she told Ellie about the time the creek froze solid enough to drive a wagon across? "You're not listening," Mrs. Garrity said, without rancor. "I am," Ellie said. "The wagon, the frozen creek." "You're listening with your ears, not your head." The old woman peered at her with the bright, slightly unsettling acuity of someone who'd lived long enough to stop pretending not to see things. "What did Wade say to you?" Ellie's hands stilled. "You saw that?" "I see everything from this window. Can't walk 20 feet without my hips screaming, so I compensate." Mrs. Garrity pulled her shawl tighter. "What did he say?" "Nothing specific, just a general reminder that unlicensed healers create complications." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "He tried the same thing with the last one. Young man, came through 2 years ago, had some training from back east. Wade had him run out of town inside a month. Told people the young man had given bad medicine to the Percival baby. Baby was fine. Man was gone." Ellie absorbed this. Why does he care? Mrs. Garrity looked at her with an expression that suggested this was a naive question. "Because Doc Crane is his man. Has been for 15 years. Crane does what Wade tells him, signs what Wade needs signed, testifies to whatever Wade needs testified to. You start healing people Crane was supposed to be healing. You start building trust Crane was supposed to have. You start being someone this town relies on." She shrugged one shoulder. "That's not a situation Wade finds useful. He's a senator. He has larger concerns than one woman with a medicine bag." "He has exactly one concern, And that concern is control. The old woman said it simply, like stating weather. He owns the bank. He owns 3 of the 4 largest claims in the territory. He's up for re-election in 6 months, and he needs Silverpass in his pocket. A town that trusts Augusta Wade and his people is a town that votes the way Augusta Wade needs. She paused. A town that starts trusting a woman he can't buy or threaten is a problem. Ellie sat back. The fire crackled. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again. The particular high whine that meant another wave of snow was coming in off the mountains. "You should stay anyway," Mrs. Garrity said. "People keep telling me to leave." "I'm not people. I'm a 73-year-old woman who has watched Wade drive out every doctor, healer, and midwife who wasn't his for 15 years. She fixed Ellie with a look that had steel behind it. "The last midwife who left, the Morrison girl, died in childbirth that fall. Would have made it with help. Didn't make it without." A beat. "So you stay. He'll make it very difficult. He will. And the town will follow his lead. Most of them." "Most of them," Mrs. Garrity agreed. "Not all." Ellie thought about Grace Holt's fingers around her wrist, the river rock in her coat pocket. She reached in without thinking and touched its smooth surface with her thumb. "Not all," she repeated. She was back at Ruth's by late afternoon, in time to find Caleb Holt standing in the front room with his hat in his hands and an expression that suggested he'd been working up to something for a while and hadn't quite gotten there yet. Ruth had made herself scarce, with the particular tact that was her best quality. "The children are both asleep," Caleb said, before Ellie could ask. "Tommy wore himself out helping Mrs. Moreno stack firewood and fell asleep in the chair. Grace went about an hour ago." "Good." Ellie set her bag down. "Her body needs the rest." "I know." He turned his hat brim through his fingers. "1 rotation. 2. I had a visit this afternoon. From Deputy Prentice." Ellie looked up. "Prentice says there's been a complaint filed. With Wade, not the sheriff. Wade's got more reach than the sheriff these days." Caleb's jaw was tight. "Complaint says you've been practicing medicine without authority. Says if you continue to see patients in Silverpass, there'll be formal action." "I see." Ellie kept her voice level. "And you're telling me this because—" "Because—" He stopped, started again. "Because it's not right, and somebody ought to tell you." He met her eyes. "And because if it weren't for you, my daughter would have—" His voice went rough, and he stopped again, and this time he let the silence carry the rest of it, rather than try to put the words in order. Ellie waited. "She stopped breathing," he said finally. "Did I tell you that? On the ride over? I had her against my chest, riding hard through the storm, and she just stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, and I hit her back, the way I'd seen done, and she started again. But those 30 seconds..." He exhaled, hard, through his nose. "Those 30 seconds are going to be with me for the rest of my life." The room was very quiet. "She's breathing fine now," Ellie said. "I know." He looked at her. "What are you going to do? About Wade?" "What I was already doing." "He's not a man to make empty threats." "I know that too." She picked up her bag. "Mr. Holt, I've had powerful men threaten me before. It didn't stop what happened to me, but it also didn't stop me." She met his eyes, steady and clear. "I'm not leaving Silverpass because Wade finds me inconvenient. There are sick people in this town who need help. And as long as that's true, I'll be here." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, complicated and slow, like weather changing on a day when you can't tell if it's going toward storm or toward clearing. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very stubborn. Ask anyone who knows me. They'll say both. The corner of his mouth made that dent again, and this time, just barely, it went 1 degree further before he pulled it back. He put his hat back on. I need to get back to the ranch before dark. The temperature's dropping, and I've got animals that need seeing to. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame, which Ellie was beginning to recognize as his particular habit when there was something else left to say that he hadn't quite decided to say yet. She gave you her rock, he said, without turning around. Ellie's hand moved involuntarily to her coat pocket. She's only ever given that to Sarah, Caleb said quietly. And to Tommy once, when he was sick with something bad. She keeps it... He stopped. She keeps it because it was in Sarah's hand when she died. Sarah used to carry it. Said it was lucky. A pause. Grace has had it in her pocket every day for 3 years. Ellie didn't say anything. There didn't seem to be anything adequate. She gave it to you, Caleb said, and then he walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind him, and Ellie stood in Ruth Marino's front room, with her hand pressed flat against the rock in her pocket, and understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that something had already shifted in this place she'd stopped to catch her breath, and that she was not going to be able to walk away from it as easily as she'd walked into it. Outside, the snow had started again. The rock stayed in her pocket. Ellie wasn't a sentimental woman. She'd made a deliberate project of that over the years, stripping sentiment away the way you strip bark from green wood. Not because sentiment was weak, but because it was expensive, and she'd learned early that she couldn't afford everything it cost. But she kept the rock. She told herself it was a reminder of why she was still in Silverpass, which was true enough to be functional, even if it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that no one had given her anything in a long time. The days that followed Grace's recovery settled into a rhythm that Ellie didn't entirely trust, but couldn't bring herself to disrupt. She saw patients in Ruth's back room, quietly, carefully, never advertising, relying entirely on word spreading the way word spreads in small places, person to person, through the particular network of women who know which neighbor is suffering in silence and which family can't afford the doctor's fee. Ruth was the center of that network, and Ruth was not subtle about her opinions. And so within 2 weeks of Grace Holt walking out of the boarding house on her own 2 feet, with her color back and her breathing clear, Ellie had seen 11 people who had no other options. Mrs. Garrity's hip. Old Pete Dalton's infected hand from a fence wire cut he'd ignored too long. The Vasquez baby's croup, which had responded beautifully to steam and a preparation of thyme and honey delivered at 2 a.m. to a mother who'd been awake for 36 hours and wept with relief when the baby's breathing eased. Ellie didn't charge what she couldn't be paid. She took firewood, preserved goods, a pound of coffee, a jar of pickled beets she didn't particularly want, but accepted because the woman who brought it needed to give something, and taking that from her would have been unkind. Dr. Crane knew. She could tell by the way he looked through her on the street, which was different from the way the townspeople looked through her. Their looking through was dismissal. His was deliberate. The studied non-acknowledgement of a man who understood that acknowledging her existence would require him to respond to it. Wade knew. He made sure she knew he knew. She'd find small things. Her room at Ruth's searched while she was out. Items moved but not taken. A message delivered through small discomforts rather than direct speech. A woman's coat knocked from its hook, her dried herbs disturbed and not replaced in their proper order. Nothing provable, everything legible. She read it and kept working. What she hadn't anticipated was Caleb Holt. He came back on the 4th day after Grace's discharge, which she might have expected. He was the kind of father who needed to verify recovery with his own eyes. He came again on the 8th day, with a load of split firewood that he stacked against Ruth's sidewall without being asked. And when Ruth thanked him, He said it was the least he could do, and left before Ellie had finished with the patient in the back room. She heard about the wood from Ruth, who delivered this information with the particular careful neutrality of a woman who has reached a conclusion and decided not to voice it. On the 12th day, he came in the afternoon and sat in Ruth's front room while Tommy and Grace occupied themselves with a checkerboard they'd found in the corner cabinet. And he talked to Ellie about nothing in particular: the horses, the weather, the price of hay when supply wagons finally got through in spring, in the careful, deliberate way of a man who has decided to practice being around another person and is approaching it with the same workmanlike patience he would apply to re-breaking a difficult horse. Ellie noticed. She chose not to name it. "Tommy tells me Grace has been drawing again," she said, during what would have been a silence if Tommy hadn't been providing a running commentary on the checker game from across the room. Caleb looked over at his daughter, who was moving a checker with the focused deliberation of a chess grandmaster. "She started about a week ago. Hadn't done it since—" He stopped in the way he still sometimes stopped around unfinished sentences about Sarah. Then continued. "She used to draw all the time. Filled up half a notebook Sarah had given her." "What does she draw now?" He was quiet for a moment. "People," he said. "People and horses mostly. And—" Another pause, different from the first. "You." Ellie turned her head. "She draws you fairly regular," Caleb said. His eyes were on his daughter, not on Ellie, which she suspected was intentional. "With your bag and your coat, she gets the hair right." The dent appeared at the corner of his mouth and didn't quite disappear this time. "Gets the expression right, too." "What expression is that?" He glanced at her sideways. "Like you're deciding whether to trust something." The room was warm. Ruth's fire was good. Ellie looked at the back of Grace's head, the blonde hair braided loosely down her back by someone who'd been practicing. Tommy, probably, with a determination that exceeded his natural aptitude for the task. And thought about a little girl who had decided the world didn't deserve her words, but was still making space for people in her drawings, still holding a record of the faces she'd chosen to keep. "She's remarkable," Ellie said quietly. "Yes," Caleb said. "Just that." Tommy looked up from the checkerboard. "I'm also remarkable," he announced, in case anyone was keeping a list. "You are," Ellie agreed, which made him look pleased and suspicious in equal measure. Grace moved another checker and took 3 of Tommy's pieces in a single chain and didn't look up. "She's been doing that since she was 4, Tommy said, to no one in particular. "It's not fair, and nobody addresses it." It was, Ellie thought later, sitting alone after they'd gone, the closest thing to a good afternoon she'd had in longer than she could accurately calculate. She didn't know what to do with that observation, except file it away with the rock in her pocket, in the category of things that were true and possibly dangerous. The trouble, when it broke, came from a direction she should have anticipated and didn't. It started with the Morrison child. Billy Morrison was 8 years old, and he came down with a chest infection in the 2nd week of January that his mother brought to Ellie in quiet desperation because Dr. Crane had seen him twice and charged twice, and the boy was getting worse instead of better. Ellen Grady Morrison was a practical woman who had been one of the first in Silverpass to whisper to a neighbor that she'd heard the herb woman had fixed Caleb Holt's daughter, and wasn't that something? She came to Ellie's back room with Billy on her hip and an expression that balanced hope against the weight of having been disappointed before. Ellie examined the boy and found what she expected, a rattling in the lower lungs that Crane's treatment of bed rest and cold syrup wasn't touching. She prescribed a steam treatment with eucalyptus and a chest poultice of mustard and flannel, and an infusion of mullein that she prepared on Ruth's stove while Ellen Morrison sat in the kitchen and watched with the transparent, exhausted attention of a mother who has been awake for too many nights and needs to believe that something will work. "He's going to be all right," Ellie told her, because she believed it, and because Ellen Morrison needed to hear it.
Dr. Crane said the same thing 2 weeks ago.
Dr. Crane prescribed bed rest. That's appropriate for some chest conditions, and not for this one. Ellie sealed the jar of infusion and handed it across. This is a different approach. You should see improvement within 48 hours. If you don't, if he gets worse rather than better, you come back to me immediately. Day or night, it doesn't matter. Ellen Morrison looked at the jar for a moment. Then she looked at Ellie with the directness of someone too tired for indirection. Why are you here? In Silverpass? Really? I had nowhere else to be. That's not an answer. Ellie considered her. I was a nurse during the war. After the war, there was an accusation. Unfair, unproven, but the kind that follows a person. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to. Not apologizing for it, not defending it, just setting it on the table. I've been moving west since then. Silverpass is where the snow caught me. Ellen was quiet for a moment. The man who accused you was my commanding officer. He needed someone to blame for a supply discrepancy he'd created himself.
And you couldn't fight it.
Not successfully. But you're still practicing.
People still get sick.
Ellen Morrison stood up, settled Billy more firmly on her hip, and looked at Ellie with something that wasn't quite gratitude yet, but was the thing that comes before it.
I'll tell people, she said, that you helped us, if it works.
I'd appreciate that. The treatment worked. 48 hours later, Billy Morrison's chest had cleared enough that Ellen could hear the difference through the bedroom wall. And she told her neighbor, Margaret Hale, about it. And Margaret Hale told the woman at the dry goods counter. And within a week, something had shifted in Silverpass. Some small but measurable degree of rotation in how people looked at Ellie when she walked down the street. Not welcoming, not safe, but less hostile than before. It was into this fragile, shifting situation that Wade made his move. He did it cleanly, the way a man does something he's been planning long enough to have worked out the angles. He didn't come at Ellie directly. He went to the people she'd helped. Ellie found out from Mrs. Garrity, who found out from her neighbor, who'd been paid a visit by one of Wade's men. A soft-spoken individual who asked quiet questions about Miss Cross and her methods, and whether any of the treatments she'd provided had caused any reaction, any discomfort, anything that might constitute harm. Very politely, very thoroughly. Building a structure of suggestion from nothing, the way you build a fire from sparks. He's collecting testimony, Mrs. Garrity said, when Ellie came by that afternoon. The old woman was taut with fury, in the way that only very old women can be furious. Contained and absolute, and all the more alarming for the containment. Going door to door. The people who've come to you, the ones who got better. He's asking them if they're sure it was you that helped, and not something they'd have gotten over on their own. The ones who didn't get better fast enough, he's asking different questions. Which people didn't get better fast enough? Old Thaddeus Klein. His cough's still bad. Thaddeus Klein has consumption. I told his wife I could help with the symptoms, but not the disease itself. There's nothing that helps with the disease itself. Ellie kept her voice level. He knows that. Wade doesn't need the facts to cooperate. He needs enough doubt. Mrs. Garrity looked at her steadily. He's going to call you before the town council. Bill Mitchell is the council chair, and Bill Mitchell owes the bank on 3 properties, and the bank is Wade's. Ellie absorbed this. Outside the window, the snow had stopped for the first time in 4 days, and the light was the particular sharp pale gold of a winter afternoon that has run out of clouds to hide behind. She sat in it and thought about the last time she'd sat before a body of men who'd already decided what she was and needed only the performance of procedure to make it official. When, she said. End of the week, Friday. Who on the council doesn't owe Wade? Mrs. Garrity thought about it. Carl Eames. He's got his own money, doesn't need the bank. and possibly Reverend Marsh, though Marsh tends to follow wherever the wind is strongest. Carl Eames, Ellie repeated. She'd seen him twice. A quiet, thin man in his 50s who ran the hardware store and seemed to be in the business of observing everything and saying very little. "He came to you," Mrs. Garrity said. "His daughter, 3 weeks ago. The baby that came early. The baby did well." "Yes, she did." The old woman leaned forward slightly. "He knows it. His daughter knows it. And Carl Eames is not a man who forgets what he owes." Ellie nodded slowly. She was doing the arithmetic she'd learned to do a long time ago. Not the arithmetic of whether she'd done wrong, because she knew the answer to that, but the arithmetic of who was listening and who had something to gain from the truth and who had something to lose from it. It was a cold kind of calculation, and she hated that she was good at it. She went back to Ruth's and found Caleb Holt's horse tied outside. He was in the front room, standing by the window, hat in his hands again, which she had definitively identified as his signal that he was about to say something he'd been arguing with himself about. Tommy and Grace were not with him. The absence of the children changed the quality of the room's silence. "You heard," Ellie said, not a question. "Prentice told me, as a courtesy." His jaw was tight. "Wade's man came to my ranch this morning, asked me questions about Grace's treatment, whether I'd observed any side effects, whether I felt I'd been fully informed of Miss Cross's qualifications before I'd entrusted my daughter to her care." He said it with a flatness that was barely containing something much hotter underneath. I told him exactly what I thought of his questions. "That won't help me." "I know." He turned from the window. "I also know it needed saying." He looked at her directly, in the way he'd been doing more often lately. Not the careful sideways assessment of the early days, but something more straightforward, more deliberate, like a man who's decided he's through with the indirection. "What are you going to do about Friday?" "Go. Answer their questions. Tell the truth and let the council decide." "The council is Wade's." "Not all of it." "Enough of it." "Probably." Ellie set her bag down on the table. "But I'm not going to run before they've even asked the questions, Mr. Holt. I've done that before. I know what it costs." "What does it cost?" "Everything you were building." She met his eyes. "Every patient who'd started to trust you. Every person who was going to come to you next week because their neighbor told them you'd helped this week. You run, and they all lose whatever you would have been to them." She paused. "I'm not doing that again." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled in the hearth. Outside, the light was going gold and thin, the way it did at 4 in the afternoon in January, sliding sideways toward dark. "Grace drew something else," he said. Ellie waited. "Drew the two of us." He said it like it was a fact that required careful handling. "Sitting on the porch, which we've never done." A beat. "She gave it to me this morning, folded up in my coat pocket." The room was very still. "She's 6 years old," Ellie said, carefully. "She draws what she wants to see." "I know what she is." His voice was low, and something in it had changed register in a way that Ellie's whole body registered before her mind had finished processing it. "I also know that she doesn't draw things she doesn't believe in. She never has. Even at 3 years old, before—" He stopped, reorganized. "Sarah used to say Grace only drew the real things, the things that were actually there, even if nobody else could see them yet." The fire crackled. Ellie looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the place where a coffee cup had left a ring months ago. She thought about Sarah Holt, who had carried a river rock and said it was lucky, and had given it to her daughter when she was dying, and who had told her daughter that drawings should be of real things, and who was somehow, in her absence, still shaping everything in this room. Mr. Holt, Ellie said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I have a council hearing in 4 days. I may be run out of this town on Friday afternoon. I am a woman with no permanent address, a reputation that precedes me in the worst possible way, and a medicine bag that is running out of 3 different things I can't restock until the pass opens in April. She looked up at him. You have 2 children who need their father whole and present, and not tangled up in someone else's trouble. You're not someone else's trouble. He said it quietly, simply, like he'd made the decision some time ago and was only now saying it out loud. You're the woman who kept my daughter breathing. You're the woman who sat with Grace all night when I couldn't stay. He stopped, and she could see him working at it. This man who thought in actions rather than words, trying to find the language for something that didn't have a simple shape. You're the only person in 6 weeks who's looked at Grace like she's worth waiting for. Not something to fix, not something to feel sorry about, just worth waiting for. Ellie's throat tightened. She did not look away. That matters to me, Caleb said. More than I know how to say properly. And I'm not going to stand by and watch Wade run you out because it's convenient for him. He held her gaze, steady and certain, the way he was steady and certain about most things once he'd made up his mind. Let me come to the hearing Friday. Let me speak. You'll make an enemy of Wade. Wade's been my enemy for 3 years. I just haven't been his. He put his hat back on, which she'd also learned was how he signaled a decision was made and the conversation about it was finished. I'll be at Ruth's by 8 on Friday morning. He was at the door before she found the words. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his first name. She heard it as she said it, heard the shift in it, and didn't take it back. He stopped, turned. Thank you, she said. He looked at her across the room, and there was something in his face in that moment. Not the hardness she'd first read there, not the careful distance of a man maintaining a perimeter around his grief, but something older and quieter and more frightening than either of those things, because it looked like the beginning of belief. Don't thank me yet, he said, and left. Ellie stood in Ruth's empty front room and pressed her hand flat against her coat pocket, against the small, smooth weight of the river rock, and listened to the sound of his horse moving away down the frozen street, and understood, with the same clarity she'd had the night Grace took her hand, that something was already in motion that she didn't have the power to stop. She wasn't sure anymore that she wanted to. Friday came in cold and clear, the kind of January morning in Montana that looked almost gentle from inside a warm room and would kill you in 40 minutes if you underestimated it. Ellie was dressed and ready before 6. She'd been awake since 4, which was honest, and she'd been awake since 2, which was the truth she didn't bother arguing with. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table and drank coffee and went over what she intended to say, not rehearsing exactly, but building the architecture of it, making sure the structure would hold under pressure. Ruth sat across from her and didn't offer advice, which was the most useful thing she could have done. Caleb arrived at 5 minutes to 8. He came in with Tommy and Grace, which Ellie hadn't expected. She looked at him over the children's heads, with an expression that asked the question without words. He shook his head slightly, not bringing them to the hearing. Ruth would keep them here. Tommy, who read rooms the way other children read picture books, looked between Ellie and his father and said nothing, which was so unusual that Grace glanced at him with what appeared to be mild concern. You'll be fine, Tommy told Ellie finally, with the decisive confidence of someone who has consulted their own judgment and found it reliable. Pa doesn't back down, ever. Ask anybody. I'll keep that in mind, Ellie said. Grace moved to Ellie's side. She didn't take her hand this time, just stood close enough that their sleeves touched. A point of contact so small, it was almost nothing, and somehow said everything. Ellie looked down at her. Grace looked up. Whatever passed between them in that moment, it settled something in Ellie's chest that had been loose and rattling since 2 in the morning. She picked up her bag. "Let's go." The town council met in the back room of the Silverpass Municipal Building, which was a generous name for a 2-room structure beside the assay office that smelled permanently of pine resin and old paper. 5 council members sat behind a long table, Bill Mitchell in the center, florid and carefully expressionless, flanked by 2 men Ellie recognized as Wades in everything but formal designation. Carl Eames sat at the far left end of the table, with his hands folded and his thin face unreadable. Reverend Marsh sat beside him and looked like a man who had arrived hoping the weather would decide the outcome for him. Wade was not on the council. He was, instead, seated in a chair against the side wall, positioned with the exact precision of a man who understands that, sometimes, the most powerful place in a room is the one that isn't formally acknowledged. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man watching a mechanism he'd built perform its function. Dr. Crane sat beside him. He was a soft man in his 50s, with a neat gray beard and the eyes of someone who had made too many accommodations over too many years and had almost stopped noticing. He looked at Ellie when she came in, and then looked away, which she'd learned to read as the specific guilt of a person who knows they're doing wrong and has decided the cost of doing right is higher than they're willing to pay. Ellie sat on the single chair placed in front of the council table. Caleb sat in the row of chairs behind her, among the half-dozen townspeople who had come to observe. Mrs. Garrity had managed to get herself there somehow, hat pinned firmly, back straight, and Earl Prentice stood near the door with his arms crossed and his face doing the work of a man who hasn't decided yet and resents being made to decide. Mitchell opened the proceeding with the bored efficiency of a man who considers the outcome already settled and is going through the procedure as a courtesy to process. He laid out the nature of the complaint: unlicensed medical practice, potential harm to community members, concerns about Miss Cross's qualifications and her fitness to practice in any capacity within the limits of Silverpass. "Miss Cross," he said when he'd finished, "do you wish to respond to these charges?" "I do." Ellie kept her hands flat on her knees. "I'd like to begin by clarifying what I have and haven't done. I have not represented myself as a licensed physician. I've been clear with every person I've seen that I'm not a doctor. I am a trained nurse with 14 years of medical experience, including 2 years of surgical field nursing during the war. I have not charged fees I wasn't authorized to collect. I have not treated anyone who came to me without their full knowledge and consent of what I was and wasn't qualified to do. Dr. Crane has raised specific concerns about your methods," Mitchell said. "Dr. Crane hasn't seen my methods." She said it plainly, without heat. "He's heard about them. There's a difference." Crane shifted in his chair. Didn't speak. "You treated the Morrison boy," Mitchell continued. "Billy Morrison, chest infection. Dr. Crane had already seen the boy twice." "Twice, yes, with no improvement. Mrs. Morrison came to me because her son was getting worse under the treatment he was receiving, not better. I assessed the situation and changed the approach. The boy recovered in 48 hours, by your account. By Ellen Morrison's account." Ellie looked at Mitchell steadily. "She's in this room, if you'd like to ask her." Mitchell looked up. Ellen Morrison was in the second row, Billy on her lap, both of them alive and pink-cheeked, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has decided she is done being frightened of the wrong people. Mitchell looked at her, and then looked back at the table. "There is also the matter of Thaddeus Klein," he said. "Mr. Klein has consumption. I was clear with his wife that I could manage his symptoms and not his disease. The disease is advanced. Nothing I do or don't do will change its course significantly. Ellie paused. Nothing Dr. Crane does either, to be fair. Some conditions are beyond the reach of current medicine. That's not negligence. That's the honest limit of what we know. From the side wall, Wade stirred. He leaned forward slightly, the motion of a man choosing the moment to insert himself. "Miss Cross," he said, in the pleasant, reasonable tone that Ellie had come to understand was his most dangerous register. "No one here doubts that you mean well. The question isn't intent. The question is qualification." He spread his hands. "Silverpass is a community with a doctor. An established, qualified doctor who knows these people and their histories. When an unlicensed individual begins operating in competition with that doctor, it creates confusion. It creates divided loyalties. And most concerning, it creates situations where people may choose an unauthorized treatment over an authorized one, with potentially serious consequences." "With respect, Senator," Ellie said, "the serious consequence I've observed most consistently in Silverpass is people not receiving adequate care because the authorized option didn't show up." Silence. She hadn't intended to say it quite that directly, but she didn't take it back. Crane's face had gone the color of old bread. Wade's pleasant expression didn't change, which was worse. "That's a serious allegation," Mitchell said. "It's a documented pattern." Ellie looked at him. "Sarah Holt died of a fever 3 winters ago when the doctor didn't come. The circuit midwife left the year before that, under circumstances that I've been told weren't voluntary, and a young woman died in childbirth that fall, who might have lived with proper assistance. Mr. Klein's consumption was not diagnosed until it was advanced, because he couldn't afford repeated consultation fees." She kept her voice even, factual. The voice she'd used in field hospitals, when she'd needed officers to hear things they didn't want to hear and act on them anyway. "I'm not here to damage anyone's reputation. I'm here because people needed help, and I was able to provide it. That's the beginning and end of my position." The room had the specific quality of silence that occurs when something has been said that everyone present knows is true, and most of them wish hadn't been said out loud. Caleb's voice came from behind her. "I'd like to speak." Mitchell looked up. "Mr. Holt, this isn't—" "My daughter stopped breathing on the ride to Miss Cross." Caleb's voice was level and absolute, and filled the room the way a large, solid object fills a space, by simply being present and being impossible to ignore. 30 seconds, maybe more. She was gone. I brought her back with my own hands on the road. When I got to Ruth Marino's, Miss Cross took her and did not stop working on her for 40 minutes. My daughter is alive. She's sitting in Ruth Marino's kitchen right now, 3 years old when you subtract what she went through this past month, drawing pictures and beating her brother at checkers. He paused. I sent for Dr. Crane before I went to Miss Cross. His boy came to my door and told me to keep her warm and wait. My daughter was not breathing, gentlemen. Warm and wait was not an option. Crane said nothing. The fact of his silence was its own testimony. Carl Eames spoke for the first time. His voice was dry and quiet, and carried the weight of a man who has been waiting for the correct moment, with the patience of someone who understands that the correct moment is the only one that matters. My granddaughter was born 6 weeks early, he said, to the table rather than the room. Luisa's daughter, born in the middle of the night in the worst cold snap of the season. Dr. Crane was unavailable. He let that word sit there for a moment, with its full load. Miss Cross was there within 20 minutes of being sent for. She was there for 4 hours. My granddaughter will be 2 months old next week. He looked at Mitchell. I'd like that entered into the record. Carl, Mitchell began. Into the record, Bill. Mitchell looked at the papers in front of him. His neck was red above his collar. Wade made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath through his nose, the sound of a man recalculating. Ellie heard it and kept her face still. "Reverend Marsh," Wade said, turning toward the end of the table with the ease of a man changing direction mid-river. "The question before this council is ultimately one of community welfare and established order. Surely that's a matter close to your concern." Marsh was a thin man with a sparse beard and the agitated energy of someone being pushed from behind. He looked at Wade. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Ellie. He looked at Ellen Morrison with Billy on her lap. His mouth opened and closed once. "I think," Marsh said finally, in the tone of a man stepping carefully onto uncertain ice, "that the Lord's work takes many forms, and that judgment ought to be measured." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't courage. But it was enough to tip the arithmetic, and everyone in the room felt it shift. Mitchell was sweating. He shuffled his papers. He looked at Wade, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man taking stock of what the situation now required. "We'll recess for deliberation," Mitchell said. Ellie stood up. She didn't wait to be dismissed. She walked to the back of the room and stood beside Ruth, who handed her a cup of tea from a flask she'd apparently brought for this purpose. And Ellie drank it and did not look at Wade, and did not look at Crane, and looked instead at the back of Caleb Holt's head as he sat with his shoulders square and his hands on his knees, and the particular stillness of a man who has said what he came to say and is prepared to deal with whatever follows. The deliberation took 20 minutes. Ellie spent them standing with Ruth and saying almost nothing, because there was almost nothing to say. Either the council would have enough courage, or it wouldn't. She'd told the truth as clearly as she could. She'd done what she could do. Mrs. Garrity appeared at her elbow during the 15th minute. "Eames will hold," the old woman said quietly. "He's solid." "And Marsh?" "Marsh will go with Eames if Eames goes first. He's not a bad man. He's a weak one. There's a difference." Mrs. Garrity's voice had the flat authority of someone who has classified most of humanity and reconciled herself to the classification. "The question is Mitchell." The question was Mitchell. Ellie knew it. Mitchell owed the bank, and the bank was Wade's, and that was a chain with no obvious weak link. She thought about this. She thought about the arithmetic of it. And then she looked up and found Wade watching her from across the room. And what she saw in his face was not the cold pleasantness he'd been performing all morning. What she saw, briefly, was calculation. The live, working kind. A man not watching a mechanism perform its function, but actively deciding what the next move needed to be. That frightened her more than the hearing had. The council filed back in. Mitchell's color was still high. He sat and looked at his papers for a moment, with the air of a man who has been given instructions he finds uncomfortable and has decided to follow them anyway. "The council has reviewed the testimony," he said. "It is the council's finding that Miss Cross's activities in Silverpass have not constituted a clear threat to public welfare." He said it like he was reading a sentence he hadn't written and didn't endorse. "However, the council would note that all medical matters of a serious nature should continue to be directed to Dr. Crane as the community's designated physician. Miss Cross is advised to maintain that boundary. Not vindication, not dismissal, the uneasy middle ground of a decision made by people unwilling to fully commit to either side." It was enough. For now, it was enough. Ellie heard Caleb exhale behind her, a slow, controlled breath, the sound of sustained tension releasing. She kept her face still and her posture straight, and waited until Mitchell had finished before she stood. She was halfway to the door when Wade spoke. "Miss Cross." His voice was pleasant again, the recalibrated pleasantness of a man who has shifted to a longer game. "The council's finding is noted. I hope you'll consider it in the spirit in which it was given. as an encouragement toward cooperation rather than competition. Ellie stopped, turned. "I always cooperate with people who are working toward the same goal I am," she said. "I have no interest in competing with anyone. I'm only interested in helping the people in this town who aren't being helped." She held his gaze. "If that stops being necessary, Senator, I'll have a great deal more free time." She walked out. The cold hit her like a wall. She stood on the step for a moment and breathed it in and let it clear her head, the clean, sharp cold that had no agenda and no hidden architecture. That was simply itself. Caleb came out behind her. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "Mitchell got a message this morning," he said quietly. "Before the hearing, I saw Wade's man come out of his office." He paused. Something changed in the room. Around the 15th minute of deliberation, I don't know what, but Mitchell came back looking like a man who'd swallowed something disagreeable. "Wade told him to let it go," Ellie said. "Today. Why would he do that?" "Because losing here was the better option." She looked out at the frozen street, at the people going about the business of a Friday morning in January, most of them pretending not to have noticed the proceeding just concluded 50 feet away. A public fight, witnesses, Eames on record, Ellen Morrison in the room with her living son. That was getting expensive. He let it go today because he has something else planned. She paused. Something that won't need a council vote. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You're certain?" "I've met men like Wade before." She turned to look at him. "They don't lose gracefully, and they don't give up. They regroup." He met her eyes. "Then we regroup too." "Caleb," she said it the way she'd said it 3 days ago, with the same awareness of the shift the name made in the space between them. "What happened in that room today, what you said, Wade isn't going to forgive that. He'll come at you now. The ranch, the water rights, everything." He was already coming at those things. His voice was steady. "He's been coming at my land for 3 years. Only difference is, now I'm not pretending I don't know what he's doing." He looked at her with that directness that she'd stopped trying to prepare herself for, because it turned out there was no preparation for it. "I told you I wasn't going to stand by. I meant it." "I know you meant it." She looked away, back at the street. "That's what worries me." "Why?" It was a simple question, and the answer was not simple. The answer involved Grace's rock in her pocket, and a drawing of 2 people on a porch, and the particular way Caleb Holt had said "we" 3 nights ago, like it was a word he'd been turning over in his hands for some time and had finally decided to keep. The answer involved 14 years of moving on, and the careful, practiced business of not letting anything become necessary. Because necessary things could be taken, and she'd had enough taken to last a lifetime. "Because you have children," she said finally, "and because you've already lost enough." "Ellie." He said her name the same way she said his, with the weight of a decision behind it. She felt it and kept looking at the street. "Look at me." She did, because she'd learned that refusing to look at things was a different kind of running, and she was tired of all the kinds. "I lost Sarah," he said. "I know what that is. I know what it costs, and I know it doesn't stop costing." He paused. "And I know the difference between protecting myself from loss and just being so afraid of it that I stop living. I spent 3 years doing the second thing." His voice dropped. "Grace stopped talking the day Sarah died. She didn't stop talking because she was broken. She stopped because she decided nothing was worth the risk of it anymore." He held Ellie's gaze. "She started drawing you before I knew your name. She gave you Sarah's rock. She did those things because she knows something that I've been slow getting to." Ellie's throat was tight. She said nothing. "This is worth the risk," Caleb said. "You are worth the risk." He said it plainly, the way he said everything once he'd decided. No embellishment, no performance, just the fact of it, set down like something solid. "And I'm done letting fear make decisions for me." Around them, Silverpass went about its Friday morning. A horse stamped at a hitching post. Smoke rose from chimneys. Two women came out of the dry goods store and glanced at them and kept walking. The ordinary, indifferent machinery of a small town in winter, turning on its axis the way it had yesterday and would tomorrow. But something had changed. Something had been said out loud that couldn't be unsaid. Placed in the air between them like the river rock had been placed in Ellie's hand. Deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was. Ellie reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the rock, smooth and familiar now, worn to her hand from weeks of being held. She thought about Sarah Holt carrying it for luck. She thought about Grace keeping it for 3 years as the only remaining piece of her mother. She thought about a 6-year-old girl making a decision, without words, about who deserved to hold the things that mattered. She thought about worth. "All right," she said quietly. Caleb waited. "All right," she said again, steadier this time. "But I need you to understand something." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to run if it gets harder. I'm not going to disappear in the night because Wade makes things uncomfortable. If I'm here, I'm here." She held his gaze. "But that means if this goes wrong, if Wade does what I think he's planning, it goes wrong for both of us. And your children are part of this too. You need to understand that before we—" She stopped, because she didn't quite have the word for what they were doing, and she suspected he didn't either. And maybe that was all right for now. "I understand it," Caleb said. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since Tuesday." The dent appeared at the corner of his mouth. "I'm a slow starter. I make up for it by being thorough." Ellie looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time in a very long time, she laughed. Not the polite, controlled version she used as social currency, but a real one, short and surprised and warm, pulled out of her without permission. Caleb's expression shifted into something she hadn't seen there before. Not the dent, not the almost smile. Something fuller and more unguarded. The expression of a man whose discipline has slipped for just a moment and revealed what's underneath, and who hasn't decided yet to cover it back up. Ruth's voice reached them from the door of the boarding house down the street. "Tommy wants to know if everything went well. Because if it did, he thinks there should be pie. And if it didn't, he still thinks there should be pie." He sent Grace as his representative. Grace was standing at Ruth's door, watching them with those calm blue eyes, her coat buttoned to the chin, her braid coming slightly undone already at the end. When she saw them both looking at her, she lifted one hand in a small, precise wave. Ellie waved back. "Come on," Caleb said, and there was something easy in it, something that hadn't been there before. A loosening in the words, like a door opening onto a room that's been kept shut for too long. "Let's not keep Tommy waiting. He has opinions about pie." They walked back down the frozen street toward Ruth's boarding house, and Ellie didn't know what Wade was planning, or how many days she had before it arrived. But she put her hand in her coat pocket and held the river rock and thought about what Caleb had said. Worth the risk. She turned the words over, the way he'd probably turned them over before saying them, testing the weight of them, checking the structure. They held. She walked into Ruth's front room and was immediately engulfed by Tommy's detailed briefing on the pie situation, and Grace materialized at her side with the quiet precision that was becoming familiar. And the fire was warm, and the coffee was hot. And outside, the clear January sky was holding its cold and its stillness like a breath. It was, Ellie thought, the most dangerous she had ever felt. Not from Wade, not from the council, not from the hearing she just walked out of. From this. From the specific, terrifying possibility of something good. Somewhere in Silverpass, in a comfortable office with a fire of his own, Senator Augustus Wade was thinking about his next move. Ellie knew that the way she knew weather coming in off the mountains, in her bones, ahead of the evidence. She poured herself coffee and held it with both hands and let herself be warm for a little while, because she'd learned the hard way that warmth, when it came, needed to be used and not just witnessed from a careful distance. She was done watching from a distance. Wade moved 3 days later. Not through the council this time, not through procedure or polite intimidation. He moved the way a man moves when he's decided that the careful approach has run its course and the direct one is overdue. Ellie found out at 6 a.m. when Earl Prentice knocked on Ruth's door with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has arrived too late to prevent something and knows it. "They took her in last night," he said when Ellie opened the door. "Ruth. Wade's men came after midnight with a paper signed by Mitchell. Said she'd been operating an unlicensed medical practice out of this building. Said she was complicit." He stopped. "She's in the jail cell. Mitchell won't release her without Wade's say-so, and Wade's say-so isn't coming." Ellie stood very still in the doorway. The cold came in around Prentice and settled against her skin, and she let it, because she needed something that was real and immediate and impossible to misread. "Where's the paper?" she said. "In Mitchell's office." "Did you read it?" "Yes." "And?" Prentice looked at his hat. "It names you, too. Says you've been treating patients in direct defiance of the council's advisement. Says there's evidence of harm." He looked up. "There isn't, Miss Cross. There's no evidence because there's no harm. But Wade found a man, someone passing through, no connection to anyone here, willing to say he received treatment from you and developed complications. A man no one in this town knows. A man Wade brought in 2 days ago and has been keeping at the hotel." Prentice's jaw was tight. "I should have come to you sooner. I saw the man arrive, and I knew what it meant, and I—" He stopped. "You were deciding," Ellie said. She kept her voice even. "You're here now. For whatever that's worth. It's worth something. Where is Wade?" "His office at the bank. Been there since 5 this morning." Ellie stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I need 5 minutes." She used 4 of them. She dressed, packed her medical bag with the things she couldn't afford to lose, and wrote a note in 2 sentences that she folded and put in her coat pocket. Then she looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall and said, without moving her lips, the thing she always said to herself before walking into a situation she couldn't fully control. "You know what you know. Lead with that." On her way through the kitchen, she stopped at the counter and wrote a second note, this one for Tommy and Grace, who were still asleep upstairs. She didn't know if Grace would have it read to her or would read it herself. She still didn't know the full geography of what Grace could and couldn't do, or rather, what she chose and didn't choose. She wrote it in case Grace read it herself. "Your father and I are handling something. Stay with Mrs. Prentice when she comes. Don't worry. Take care of your brother." She underlined the last sentence because Tommy was the one who would need taking care of, and Grace would understand that without being told, but it never hurt to make the assignment official. Prentice had his horse outside. "I'll ride out to Holt's place," he said. "Tell him what's happening." "He'll come into town." "Yes, he will." Wade knows that. Wade is counting on it. Ellie thought for a moment. "Tell him to go to Carl Eames first. Not here, not to the jail, not to the bank. To Eames. Tell him to wait there." She looked at Prentice steadily. "Can you do that?" "I can try." "Do more than try, Deputy." Something in his face resolved, the way a man's face resolves when he's finally done negotiating with himself, about which side of a line he's on. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and rode. Ellie walked to the bank. The main street of Silverpass was quiet in the gray January morning, the cold sitting flat and heavy over everything, smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the windless air. A few people were out, the man who opened the general store, a woman hurrying somewhere with her shawl pulled tight. They saw Ellie, and they looked, and they didn't speak. The way people in small towns don't speak when they know something is happening and haven't yet decided what it requires of them. Wade was at his desk when she walked in. He looked up, and his expression did the thing it always did, assembled itself into pleasantness with the speed of long practice. "Miss Cross." He leaned back in his chair. "This is early." "You have Ruth Moreno in a jail cell," Ellie said. She stood in front of his desk and did not sit down, because sitting would suggest a negotiation, and she hadn't come to negotiate. "You'll release her this morning." "I'm afraid that's a matter for the council." "It's a matter for you. We both know it." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "You had her arrested to draw me here. So here I am. Let her go." Wade studied her with the calm, assessing look of a man who is genuinely interested in what he's looking at. "You're direct," he said. "I've always found that in you. It's an admirable quality in the right circumstances." "Release her, Senator." "I'll release Mrs. Moreno when you and I have reached an understanding." He said it pleasantly, like an entirely reasonable business proposal. "You leave Silverpass. Today. I'll have a horse and supplies ready within the hour. You go, Mrs. Moreno goes home, and this entire situation resolves itself quietly." "And my patients?" "Dr. Crane will see to your patients." "Dr. Crane didn't see to them before I came. That's how I'm here." "Miss Cross." Wade's voice shifted slightly, not hard, but moving in that direction. "You have done some genuine good in this town. I'm not disputing that. But you've also disrupted an established order that serves important functions. Disruption has costs. I think you know that." He paused. "I'm offering you an exit that doesn't damage you further. The alternative, the paper Mitchell has, the witness testimony, formal charges, that follows you, wherever you go next, wherever you go after that." Ellie looked at him. She looked at the neat desk, the careful arrangement of the office, the portrait of a younger Wade on the wall behind him, with a woman beside him who looked like she'd been happy once, and hadn't known yet what the years would build around her. She thought about what Mrs. Garrity had told her. "I was hoping not to lose another wife to a fever." And she thought she finally understood Wade, in the way that understanding someone doesn't make them right, and doesn't make you feel any better about what they've become. "You had a wife," she said. Something shifted in his face, fast and deep and involuntary. "That is not, you lost her because she didn't have adequate care, because you didn't have money then, or the right connections, or enough power to make someone come when you needed them to come." She kept her voice quiet, not cruel, just clear. "And you spent 30 years since then making sure you had enough power that you'd never be helpless like that again." She paused. "I understand that, truly. But what you've built, Senator, the control, the people you own, the doctors who do what you say instead of what's right, that's not protection. That's the same helplessness dressed up in better clothes. Because when the next person you love gets sick, you'll have a doctor who answers to you. And a doctor who answers to you isn't a doctor anymore. He's a man with instruments and no backbone, and that is considerably worse than nothing." The room was very quiet. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger, not recalculation. Something older and less managed. The look of a man who has been handed a mirror he didn't ask for. Then it closed over. The pleasantness came back, thinner now, with the working parts showing at the edges. "You have 2 hours," he said. "Then I file the paperwork." Ellie nodded once and walked out. She didn't go to the jail. She went to Carl Eames' hardware store, which was where she'd told Prentice to send Caleb. And when she pushed the door open, she found Caleb already there, standing with Eames at the back counter. And the expression on his face when he saw her was the expression of a man who has been holding something too tightly for too long and has just been given permission to put it down. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped in front of her, close, scanning her face with the focused attention of a man doing damage assessment. "Are you hurt?"
No.
"What did he say?"
Leave today or face formal charges.
She looked past him at Eames.
Carl, what's your read on the council if this goes back to them today?
Eames was quiet for a moment. He was a precise man, not given to unnecessary speech, and his silences tended to be more useful than other people's sentences. "Mitchell won't hold," he said finally. "Not with formal charges on the table." The optics of the council overruling formal charges would cost him more than it costs him to go along. He looked at Ellie. Marsh might hold, might not.
What about outside the council?
What do you mean?
I mean the town.
Ellie looked at him steadily.
Not the council, not the officials, the people. Ellen Morrison, the Vasquez family, the women who've been coming to Ruth's back room for 6 weeks. What happens if this goes public? Not as a hearing, not as a procedure, but openly, in the street, where people can hear the whole of it.
Eames considered. "Wade's strongest asset is operating through channels," he said. "He owns the channels. In the open, it's a different question."
Yes, it is.
Ellie turned to Caleb.
Ruth needs to be out of that cell. Can Prentice do it?
"Prentice will do whatever I ask him at this point," Caleb said. His voice had the flat certainty of a man who has assessed a situation and arrived at his strategy. "He's been sitting on the wrong side of this for 3 years, and he knows it. The cell thing was the last thing he needed to see." He paused. "But even if Prentice releases Ruth, Wade can rearrest her. He needs to be stopped at the source, not managed around." "I know." "Then tell me what you need." Ellie looked at him, this man who thought in actions, who moved through the world by deciding what was right and then simply doing it with both hands, who had been standing still for 3 years inside his grief, and had apparently, at some point in the last 6 weeks, decided to start moving again. She felt the rock in her pocket. She felt the specific weight of what she was about to ask, which was not small, and which would cost him something, and which he would do anyway. Because that was who he was, and she'd known it since the night he rode through a blizzard with his daughter against his chest. "I need you to stand next to me," she said. "In the street, in front of people, and say what you said at the hearing, except louder, and in front of Wade, not in front of a council that owes him money."
That's all?
"That's not a small thing, Caleb."
No, he agreed, but it's a straightforward one.
He looked at her the way he'd looked at her outside the council building 3 days ago, with that thing in his face that she'd stopped trying to name, and had started just letting be what it was. Then he looked at Eames.
"Get word to Ellen Morrison, and Ruth's neighbor, Mrs. Vega, and whoever else you know who's been to Ellie for help and has a spine."
He picked up his hat.
"We're not doing this quietly."
What happened in the next hour in Silverpass was the kind of thing that small towns talk about for 30 years, in the way that small things which turn out to matter always get talked about. Exaggerated in some details, understated in others, but true in the essential shape of it. Prentice walked into the jail and released Ruth Moreno on his own authority, citing a procedural deficiency in the arrest paperwork, which was not technically false because he'd introduced the deficiency himself when he'd signed the release form. Ruth came out with her braids still neat and her expression serene in the way of a woman who had never for a single moment believed she'd be in that cell past morning. Ellie was standing in the main street when it happened. Caleb stood beside her. Carl Eames stood behind her to the left. Mrs. Garrity had appeared from somewhere, leaning on her cane, looking comfortable. Ellen Morrison was there, Billy on her hip, with the expression of a woman who has made her decision and would like to see what happens next. The Vasquez family. 3 other women Ellie recognized from Ruth's back room, and Ruth herself, who walked out of the jail and straight to Ellie's side and stood there without drama, as if she'd simply stepped out for a walk. Word moved through a town like weather. Within 20 minutes, people had come out of doors and stopped on the street and arranged themselves in the unconscious geometry of a community taking stock of itself. Wade came out of the bank when the crowd was large enough to make the scene impossible to ignore. He came out with Mitchell beside him and 2 of his men behind him, and he looked at what was assembled in the street in front of him with the expression of a man who has discovered that the geography has shifted under his feet while he was busy managing the terrain. "This is unnecessary," he said, addressing the street at large with his practiced, reasonable voice. "This is a private legal matter, being conducted through proper channels. There is no cause for—" "My daughter was dying." Caleb's voice cut through the reasonable tone the way a cold front cuts through mild air. Not loud, just a different order of thing. "February, 3 years ago. Fever came on fast. I sent for the doctor at 10 in the evening. He was looking at Wade, but the words were for everyone else. Dr. Crane sent back word that conditions weren't suitable for travel." Conditions. Sarah died at 4 in the morning. He paused. "I've never said that out loud in this town before. I'm saying it now." Crane, who had appeared at some point at the edge of the gathered people, had gone the color of ash. "6 weeks ago, my daughter Grace stopped breathing on the road in a blizzard," Caleb continued. "This woman," he didn't gesture at Ellie, just said it, steady and clear. "This woman worked on her for 40 minutes without stopping. Grace is 6 years old, and she is alive. That is not a complicated situation, Senator. That is a woman doing her job." Wade's composure was holding, but holding the way ice holds in February, intact on the surface with the structure compromised underneath. "Mr. Holt, I understand your personal gratitude, but the rule of law—" "The rule of law," Ellen Morrison said, from 2 feet to Ellie's right. Her voice was sharper than Caleb's, and less controlled and more devastating for it. "The rule of law let my son get worse for 2 weeks while I paid for visits that did nothing. This woman fixed him in 2 days." She looked at Wade with the specific, irrefutable fury of a mother who has been frightened for her child and has found a target for it. "You tell me which one of those is the rule of law working." A sound moved through the crowd. Not loud, just a shift, a murmur. The sound of a group of people who have been holding a particular posture for a long time and have simultaneously decided to change it. Reverend Marsh was in the crowd. Ellie saw him. He was standing very still, with his hands clasped in front of him. And she watched him look at Wade, and look at Caleb, and look at the faces around him, doing the same calculation he'd done in the council room, feeling the same uncertain ice. She saw the moment he made his choice. "I came to this territory 30 years ago," Marsh said, loudly enough to carry. "I've buried more people in this town than I care to count. Fevers, infections, childbirth, things that didn't have to go the way they went." He paused, and in the pause you could hear the weight of 30 years of funerals pressing down. "I've been asked on those occasions to provide comfort. I've done my best. But comfort is not the same as prevention, and His voice thinned slightly. "I have stood in places where I should have spoken, and I did not speak. I'm speaking now. This woman has helped people in this town. That is a fact, and it should be treated as one. The ice broke. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way ice actually breaks in a thaw. Section by section, the structure giving way under accumulated weight, until the whole thing is moving. Mitchell said something to Wade, quiet and urgent, and Wade turned to look at him with an expression that was evaluating rather than angry. The expression of a man already deciding how to frame the retreat. Crane had disappeared into the crowd, or out of it. Ellie couldn't tell which. Wade's two men were standing slightly apart from him, with a particular posture of hired help who have decided to be unavailable for whatever comes next. Wade looked at Ellie across the crowd. She looked back at him. In his face, she saw the thing she'd been watching for. Not defeat, because men like Wade didn't process defeat as defeat. They processed it as a change in tactical conditions. But something. The acknowledgement of a wall he hadn't expected and couldn't, in this moment, climb. She saw him file it, assess it, begin the longer calculation. "Miss Cross," he said. His voice was still pleasant. The pleasantness was genuine now in a different way. Not performance, but control. And the two were different. And she respected the distinction, even as she rejected what it was in service of. "It appears the community has made its feeling known." "It appears so." "I trust you understand this doesn't resolve the broader questions of licensing and standard of care." "I trust you understand that broader questions of licensing don't bury children who didn't have to be buried." A long moment. "We'll call it a discussion to be continued," Wade said. "You can call it whatever you like, Senator." He went back into the bank. Mitchell followed. The crowd stayed in the street for another 20 minutes, doing what crowds do when something is shifted. Talking, processing, reforming into smaller groups, and trading the details of what had just occurred. Ellie stood in the middle of it and felt simultaneously exhausted and very calm. The specific calm that comes not from safety, but from having done exactly what you were capable of doing and nothing less. Ruth appeared at her left side. Tommy appeared from somewhere in the crowd at her right, breathless and bright-eyed, with Grace one step behind him, which meant Prentice's wife had apparently not been able to contain Tommy once the word reached wherever they'd been waiting, which was entirely predictable. "Did we win?" Tommy demanded. "We didn't lose," Ellie said. "That's not the same thing." "No, but it's enough for today." Tommy considered this with the rigorous fairness he applied to most things. "Okay," he decided. "But next time I want to be here for the actual thing, and not waiting at the deputy's house." Grace moved to Ellie's side in her quiet, precise way, and slipped her hand into Ellie's without announcement. Her fingers were cold through her mittens. Ellie held on. Caleb appeared on her other side. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood close enough that his shoulder was against hers, looking at the street, at the people dispersing in the winter morning, at the bank where Wade had retreated to recalculate. After a moment, he reached over and took her free hand, the one Grace wasn't holding. And that was all. Just that. Warm and solid and unhurried. A man holding a woman's hand in a cold street because he wanted to, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "He'll come back at this," Caleb said. "Different angle. He doesn't quit." "I know." "Then we don't quit either." Ruth made a sound of agreement from somewhere behind them. Mrs. Garrity's voice carried across the thinning crowd, saying something about pie and the absolute conviction of a woman who had earned a second opinion on the matter and intended to have it honored. Ellie looked down at Grace. The little girl was looking up at her with those clear blue eyes. Sarah's eyes. The eyes that saw everything and said only what they chose to say. And in them, Ellie found what she'd been quietly looking for without knowing it. The expression of a child who has been waiting, with the inexhaustible patience of someone who has decided something is worth waiting for, and has turned out to be right. "Are you all right?" Ellie asked her softly. Grace looked at her for a long, still moment.
Then she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was barely more than a breath, rough from 3 years of disuse. The voice of a child who has chosen, at this particular moment, in this particular cold street, to give back to the world something she'd taken away. "Yes," Grace said. One word, barely audible. But Caleb's hand tightened on Ellie's, and she felt the shudder that went through him. The thing he didn't make a sound about because there was no sound big enough for it. And Tommy made a strangled noise beside her and grabbed his sister's other hand and didn't say a single word, which was the most extraordinary thing Tommy Holt had ever done in his life. Ellie looked down at Grace, at this small, grave, relentless child who had spent 3 years deciding whether the world deserved her voice, and had, on a cold January morning in a Montana silver town, with her father's hand linked to a woman's and her brother close at her side, decided that it did. She thought about what she'd said to the empty creek back in November, standing alone at the edge of a town that didn't want her, asking herself for the 100th time whether she was still worth something, whether the thing that kept her moving toward the sick and the struggling, even when the sick and the struggling had no particular interest in treating her well, was a virtue or just a very elaborate form of self-destruction. She knew the answer now. She had the rock in her pocket to remember it by, and the small warm hand in her left, and the large steady hand in her right, and the voice of a little girl who had decided that one word was enough to start with. That one word, offered once, to the right person, in the right moment, was sufficient to begin the work of coming back. The world had given Ellie Cross exactly nothing easily. It had taken her credentials and her reputation and years of her life and her faith in people's willingness to do right by each other. It had given her in return a blizzard that stranded her in a town that didn't want her, and 2 children who decided she was worth drawing, and a man who drove through the dark to speak for her in public and held her hand after in the street without apology. Some returns, she thought, were disproportionate in the right direction. She held on, to Grace, to Caleb, to the ordinary, extraordinary fact of standing in the cold with people who needed her and whom she needed, which was not a small thing, and which she would not make small by calling it anything less than what it was. Ellie Cross had spent 14 years outrunning the thing that was chasing her. She had run west, and then further west, until the mountains stopped her, and the snow closed the pass, and the choice to stay was made for her by weather and exhaustion, and a little girl who stopped breathing on a dark road. And in the stain, she had found not safety. Safety was still a long way off, and Wade would see to that. But something more durable than safety. She had found the people who would stand next to her while she worked. That, finally, was enough to build on. And she intended to build.